DCC is awesome, but converting to DCC can be really scary, especially if you've been in DC for a long time. Let's defang some of those fears today. Hey everybody, my name's Jimmy. I am drinking some Dunkin' Donuts coffee today. If you want to tell me what kind of coffee you are drinking and have it put just like these guys right here, you can put that in the comments below. Cheers, guys. Today I'm going through skills, tips, and tricks to converting locomotives to DCC. Now, if you want to dive really deep into this, Larry Puckett, aka the DCC guy and a fellow North Carolinian, is an invaluable resource to all things DCC. His channel is linked right up here, and it will be linked at the end as well. Seriously, awesome channel. The most basic form of DCC conversion is converting a DCC Ready locomotive. These locomotives are DC coming from the factory, but they're designed in a way that a DCC decoder can be easily installed. This can be done using a standard socket like a 21-pin connector, which you see on a lot of HO scale locomotives, or a Next 18 connector, which is an up-and-coming big-time standard for N-scale that's really cool and I really like, or a DCC decoder specifically made to fit the locomotives like you see with Kato or Atlas in N-scale locomotives. Typically, you will see more fitted decoders in N-scale than other larger scales because of size constraints. Most decoder manufacturers have some guide for their decoders in terms of figuring out which one you need. The companies that do it the best, in my opinion, are Soundtrax and Digitrax. They actually have decoder selectors online on their website that tell you which decoders will work with what locomotive. TCS is also pretty good too. You can find the info you need in their installation guides, and it's pretty well organized. Now, ESU and NCE, I did have some difficulty figuring out which decoder to use with which one. You kind of have to look through the decoders themselves. Now, if you're looking to convert a DC locomotive that is not DCC ready, have no fear. There are a ton of decoders out there, and really your options are more wide open if you're doing non-DCC ready. There are just a few things to consider. The first is to inspect your locomotive and see how much space you have to fit a decoder into it. This is especially important in N-scale because you may need to cut into the chassis or have somebody mill that for you. Next, don't be afraid of all those wires coming out of the decoders. The NMRA has standardized the wires color coding scheme so that you know exactly where to hook them up. Red is for the right rail power pickup, black is for the left rail power pickup, orange is for the positive motor connection, gray is for the negative motor connection, blue is the common positive for the lights, white is the negative for the front light, and yellow is the negative for the rear light. And you may have some additional wires like green for functions, and you may have some speaker wires as well. But these are the main ones that you will see on every decoder that's not meant to just be plugged in. Older locomotives tend to have less efficient motors that require more power. So I tend to install decoders with a higher peak amperage in older locomotives. This means it can supply more power to the motor. You may also want to consider something like a repower kit that gives you the parts to upgrade a locomotive's motor to a more efficient modern electric motor. Northwest Shortline is the most well-known maker of these kits, and I will link them below. So you know where to connect the wires, and you may have your new motor to put into it from a repower kit or something. This is where you're going to have to do some soldering. So if you're not confident with your soldering, you may want to do some practice and figure out, maybe just buy some blank circuit boards or things like that, things that you can just practice doing a little bit of soldering on. But we'll get to practicing here in a minute about that. But let's say you've got your connections all soldered up. The next thing you need to do is isolate the motors and your connections. This is because a lot of the chassis you're going to run into are made of mostly metal or entirely metal. I like to do this with Kapton tape. It's extremely thin and easy to use, and it's not expensive at all. You will need to make sure that the motor is isolated from the chassis because this can cause a short. A lot of DC locomotives use the chassis as the connection between the rails and the motors, especially in N-scales. Some will have the wiring and some will just run the power straight through that chassis. So Isolating the motor is very important, and a little Kapton tape wrapped around the motor pickups should do you just fine. One thing that can be really helpful when installing a decoder is a magnetic parts tray. These are great for holding your parts in place so that you don't lose them, because once you lose them, especially with older locomotives, you may have trouble finding them again. If you are doing sound, you need to consider that sound decoders draw significantly more power, and you will need to find a place for the speaker and maybe a capacitor that's attached as well. You'll see that on a lot of Digitrax decoders. Sugar Cube speakers are great, they're really small, and Soundtrax has some exceptionally small Sugar Cube speakers that sound really good. When you are using a Sugar Cube speaker, the addition of a baffle to amplify the sound will make your locomotive sound great. All these tips are great, but like I said, practice makes perfect. So you want to practice on this. You don't want to go straight into it. You want to do this for real, but you don't want to start on that super rare locomotive of your collection that may have been one of a kind back in the 1970s or 80s. Buy some cheap junk locomotives to practice on. Old Tyco and Bachmann locomotives can be found pretty cheap online, and they're great to practice. They have all of the basics, and when you're ready, you can just use your soldering iron and pull that decoder right back out and put the decoder into a different locomotive. The easiest locomotives I have converted in N-scale are Lifelike and Concord. In HO scale, it's Athearn and Bachmann. DCC conversions are like anything else. Practice makes perfect. And with time and a little work, you too can be given old locos a second chance at life. Thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, bring some coffee, and happy railroading.